Hello! I know it's been almost a year since I posted a video here. I am not dead. But will American children be able to say the same in 4 years' time? As President-elect Donald Trump confirms Bobby Kennedy Jr. as his pick for the head of the Department of Health and Human Services, Health Secretary, an extremely important position, we will soon find out if the rest of us outside America are in the control arm of a huge experiment with healthcare. RFK Jr. is of course best known for his long-standing opposition to childhood vaccinations, which he claims is simply motivated by his concern for children. Clearly something that unites Kennedy and Trump's other recent cabinet pick, Matt Gaetz. They both just love children. Now, I know Trump and RFK have been BFFs for the last few months, but I assumed that when push came to shove, Kennedy would say something about banning junk food and Trump, Big Mac in hand, would be like, "You're fired," and soon he'd be giving him the old never heard of him treatment. But just like XQC betting $700,000 on Kamala, I was wrong. Here they are chowing down on that evil junk food that RFK Jr. only recently called poison, but hey, rules for thee, not for me. I saw a comment underneath this that it's like when a gang makes a new guy do some drugs to make sure he's not a cop, which I quite enjoyed. But RFK Jr. is of course already on drugs that he doesn't need, as he is a paid-up member of Team Testosterone, along with his pal Joe Rogan and his workout partner Andrew Huberman. I'm sorry, we interrupt this bulletin to bring you some breaking news. Continuing America's noble tradition of elevating TV and movie stars to the highest corridors of power, Donald Trump has now made his next pick, and he's chosen the OG medical influencer himself, the blueprint for every quack grifter on Instagram or TikTok. Yes, the man who in 2014 was subject to a congressional hearing about the prolific volume of misinformation on his show, where he was told during the hearing that the scientific community were monolithic against him, none other than Dr. Mehmet Oz, to head up, brace yourselves, Medicare and Medicaid. If that doesn't ring alarm bells, let me explain. The US has the biggest economy in the world, and it spends more of its GDP, that's American tax dollars, on healthcare than any other country in the world. I mean, as a percentage. An enormous chunk of that goes on Medicare and Medicaid. And now you have Bro, who has spent his entire career peddling pseudoscience, in charge of the budget. How exciting that now Medicare and Medicaid patients can expect to get juice cleanses and coffee enemas for their abdominal pain, get the green light for raspberry ketone and Cambodia weight loss supplements to tackle their obesity, colloidal silver for their infected leg, or red onion and selenium for their ovarian cancer. Or actually, probably more depressingly and more realistically, hydroxychloroquine for cancer. It's surely just a matter of time before the light entertainment lineup is completed and Dr. Phil is put in charge of family services. Then the clown makeup will have been fully applied. I know Joe Rogan catches heat for platforming quacks these days, but when it comes to the originals, the boomers, the founding fathers of the grifterverse, she can hang out with Michelle Obama as much as she likes, but Oprah, these guys are on you. We actually have to interrupt for another bit of breaking news. I can't keep up with this administration. It's sod's law, isn't it? I go months not making a video, then try and bring one out quickly and try and cover current affairs, but this administration's changing so rapidly, my video keeps getting out of date because now Matt Gaetz has pulled out of the race. So my earlier joke doesn't make any sense. So that's it, lesson learned. No more topical news stories for me. So how did we get here? Now, I say we, even though I am not American, but the United States has an enormous influence on the rest of the world, particularly when it comes to healthcare. So this has the potential to affect us all, especially when you consider that he will also be in charge of the NIH, responsible for a huge amount of the world's most important medical research for decades. Really, look them up. It's an incredible track record of which the USA should rightly feel hugely proud. He'll also be in charge of the CDC and the FDA. Now, you might have clicked on this video expecting some comical dunking on a dog-eating, whale-decapitating, bear molester, and I cannot promise that I will not stray into that territory, but my ire is not limited to just that scion of Camelot. No, I'll be spraying criticism all over the place in this video like a distressed skunk about to be hit by Bobby Kennedy's car. I know I've been away from the main channel for a long while, and I was hoping to return with a mammoth video that I've kind of been working on for months, which is kind of tangentially related to this one. But in the end, I'm back with one that I've written and shot in about 6 hours, and I am nothing if not inconsistent. Now, a couple of days ago, I met with some of the UK's finest YouTubists, and faced with ejection from that shadowy cartel due to inactivity, I remembered I had a YouTube channel of my own, and I return to you now with something of an emergency broadcast inspired by last week's news. However, some of this script did come easily because I confess I shot a whole video loosely inspired by RFK Jr.'s recent popularity about a year ago, and I never posted it. And this rather coincided with me stepping back from social media, broadly because I became frustrated with the inability to have productive dialogue, especially around things like vaccines. We, the scientific and medical community, make the same error as the anti-vaccine crowd, which is talking about vaccines like some monolithic thing, and I think this has been a spectacular mistake. Imagine if I said, tablets work. It would sound daft. A point I raised way back at the start of 2022 was that conflating COVID vaccines with childhood vaccines, two effective but very, very different things, has had a negative impact on people's overall opinion of vaccines, and most damagingly on childhood vaccination uptake. For the majority of the historical fight with the science-denying anti-vaxxers, who, by the way, have been a presence ever since Edward Jenner first reported his discovery in 1796, but they have been turbocharged by the internet in recent years, the vaccines available through this time were fairly comparable in terms of their application, and they were overwhelmingly aimed at children. MMR, tetanus, polio, and of course, not too long ago, smallpox too. These are some of the greatest achievements of humanity that have changed the entire trajectory of our species, of the planet. But medical research has moved onward. We now have way more vaccines than even when I was a child, and that is a good thing. They all have great uses, but to lump them all together has led to a fundamental misunderstanding among a large tranche of the population. We should be able to discuss the differences between vaccines, both in terms of who they benefit and what their effects are, and without people assuming the worst about each other's intentions and arguments. I've also had a video in mind for a while that this will draw a bit from, which was sort of loosely titled America is Making Everyone Sick, about the truly awful state of healthcare in the US and how this causes ripples the world over, never more starkly seen than over the last 4 years. I don't think any other affluent country could have arrived at a pick like RFK Jr., and I will explain why I think this is a uniquely American result due to a healthcare system which routinely fails both patients and staff, but benefits insurance companies and pharmaceutical companies. So while some of these thoughts have been rattling around in my head alongside my brainworm, nevertheless, this is a somewhat off-the-cuff video. Now, the premise of that video that I didn't post last year, which I made not long after Kennedy's appearance on the Joe Rogan Experience, was asking how on earth someone with views as patently deranged as RFK Jr. could be taken seriously by otherwise fairly sensible people. If Joe Rogan is questioning your claims, then you exist in a rarefied air at least 4 standard deviations away from the mean. But fast forward a year, and not only is he being taken seriously by podcasters, with Rogan seemingly forgetting his incredulity at his wilder claims, he is about to have enormous control over millions of people's lives. I regret not uploading that video, but things always seem clearer through the retrospectoscope. Make no mistake, RFK Jr. is indeed crazy. I'm already reading media organizations and individuals online saying utterly inaccurate things like, he's not anti-vax, he's just skeptical about the COVID vaccine, and minimizing 20 years of unscientific, disproven, idiotic claims. I hadn't heard of the term sane washing before, but Dr. Benjamin Mazur, whose writing I always like, wrote an excellent piece highlighting how even clout-chasing doctors are now towing the line and ignoring the madness of King Bobby simply because they agree with him on a few things. And he does indeed have some good points, which I will go into, but let's not pretend that he has arrived at those using critical thinking and scientific evidence. He operates entirely on vibes. And I am stunned that people who have previously been vocally critical of him are now sane-washing him because he is soon to be in power. I don't know if it's stupidity or blind naivety or maybe just self-interest that is behind this reputation remodeling, but it helps no one. If you agree with him on some things he says, great, I do too. But a stopped clock is right twice a day, and we do not laud it as being a promising timepiece. It's a similar phenomenon to Richard Dawkins' truly risible recent tweet about Elon Musk, where he pronounced that while Trump is awful, Musk is a highly intelligent and diametrically opposed person to Trump because he has the welfare of the world at heart. Chat, are these people sniffing glue? Now, this video isn't just about one guy. It's also about the MAHA movement, Make America Healthy Again, of course part of the Make America Great Again cinematic universe. And by the way, completely irrelevant to any of this, but MAHA in Hindi or Sanskrit means great, which is completely accidental, but that is legit excellent, internally consistent branding. I've got to give credit where it's inadvertently due. Maybe one to entice the crunchy yoga conspirituality types, many of whom certainly find themselves under the MAHA parasol. Now, I don't want to focus on the litany of unhinged things that RFK Jr. has said over the years. I'll put some links below if you want to read more. But just in case you have only learnt about him recently, which is quite possible because he was absolutely on the fringes of normal society for many years, in spite of his dynastic pedigree. And it should be said that the Kennedy family themselves have disowned him. But let me spend just a couple of minutes on a few of his greatest hits, all of which are clearly documented on camera or in his own writing. He has said on multiple occasions that HIV might not cause AIDS. It does. This is not an area of, we're not quite sure. There is no scientific uncertainty about this. It's a fact. If you just think he's a health kook, let's chuck some racism and anti-Semitism in here. He claimed that COVID-19 was bioengineered to target white and black people, specifically designed to spare Ashkenazi Jews and Chinese people. And in his book, The Real Anthony Fauci, Bill Gates, Big Pharma, and the Global War on Democracy and Public Health, nice snappy title, he alleges that Anthony Fauci and Bill Gates are members of a vaccine cartel, actively trying to kill patients by denying them hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin, and that they have secretly funded doctors to produce fraudulent studies showing that the drugs were ineffective against COVID so that they could enforce global lockdowns and develop 5G networks. Now, to be clear, hundreds of trials at this point, hundreds have been done on hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin in dozens of countries outside the US, and these drugs do not work for COVID. He spends a lot of time in the book explaining how harmful 5G is and that Wi-Fi and 5G can cause leaky brain, which is not a real thing, and they can also cause cancer. He claims that atrazine in the water supply, a chemical, the regulation of which, by the way, was reduced during Trump's first presidency. God, pregnancy, I don't think I'd be ready for that if that's truly dystopian. Well, maybe if Trump actually has become pregnant, Kennedy could be onto something, because what he said about atrazine was that he felt atrazine in the water supply could be responsible for turning children gay or trans. He has, as recently as last week, promoted ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine as being effective against illnesses they have been shown to be useless for. Now, these are two well-established old medications, which of course rose to prominence during the pandemic. He said school shootings could be caused by antidepressants, but of course, by far, he is most famous for 2 decades of rampant vaccine disinformation. Indeed, RFK Jr. was identified by the Center for Countering Online Hate as perhaps the highest profile voice in the disinformation dozen. 12 people responsible for 2/3 of false information about vaccines on the internet. He has promoted the long since disproven, repeatedly disproven idea that vaccines can cause autism. So RFK Jr. is not a vaccine skeptic. He's not someone with a rational approach to his assertions. Now, he has rejected the label of anti-vaccine because he says he's simply in favor of safe vaccines, which sounds totally reasonable. But when you have been following the anti-vaccine movement as long as I have, you know that this is straight out of the anti-vaccine playbook. Oh, I'm in favor of childhood vaccines, but it's this particular ingredient. Oh, it's the schedule. It's the volume. It's the fact that they're combined. All I want is for the children to be safe. And who can argue against safe children? But in reality, there is nothing that will ever satisfy the continually shifting goalpost that the anti-vaccine movement sets. And actually, I think even RFK Jr. knows this, as he has said in recent interviews that he does not plan to ban childhood vaccines. At least some good news. I think most Americans of all political persuasions still understand that childhood vaccination is of crucial importance, but what he does want to do is normalize parents declining to vaccinate their children, to reduce any compulsion to vaccinate your kids, and to alter the schedule, all of which we know leads to a reduction in vaccine uptake and completion of vaccine courses. And the thing with vaccines is, Even if it is a minority of people that does this, the knock-on effects can be huge. It's an unusual intervention in medical terms because if you decide to take a statin or something like that, it doesn't affect those around you, which isn't the case for childhood vaccines. Trust in public health officials and healthcare professionals is probably at its lowest in the US since before the start of the 20th century. And under RFK Jr., this will only deteriorate further as we know that the MAHA movement that he has surrounded himself with is predicated upon attacking conventional medicine and doctors. And this will have long-lasting and enormous repercussions if he comes good on his pledge to stop funding infectious disease research. This could obviously increase the likelihood of future pandemics and moreover could erode America's position as the preeminent force in medicine worldwide. RFK Jr. is an environmental lawyer by background. He has no background really that would make him an appropriate pick for health secretary, and there is still a possibility that the Senate doesn't approve Trump's pick. But he does have some experience in shaping a nation's health. In 2018, 2 children in the Pacific island nation of Samoa died after receiving a measles vaccine. The 2 nurses who administered the vaccines had accidentally mixed the vaccine with an anesthetic agent rather than the correct diluent. Children's Health Defense, the non-profit that RFK Jr. ran until he became a presidential candidate, again, think about the emotive name, why would anyone be opposed to children's health, spread disinformation about vaccines in Samoa, saying that the deaths were caused by the measles vaccine, even when the truth was known. And RFK Jr. himself visited Samoa to lend his celebrity endorsement to the leading anti-vaccine voices in the country, hugely amplifying their impact. Vaccination rates fell precipitously, and there was a devastating measles outbreak that infected 3% of the entire population of the country, leaving 83 people, over 90% of whom were children, dead from an entirely preventable disease. So it is certainly possible that we will now see outbreaks of diseases like measles in pockets all over the US, which can be thought of as nothing but a tremendous shame. I gave a talk last week at my old medical school, St. George's in London, and in the lobby stands a statue of fellow alumnus Sir Edward Jenner, who I've already mentioned. He discovered vaccination and has saved millions upon millions of lives. If I'd known I'd be making this video, I'd have shot a little clip in front of it. Actually, I do have some footage of me in front of the statue. I don't think I look any older, so you might not realize that this footage is actually from a couple of years ago. Mr. Anderson, like what I've done with the place?
Hi, Princess. प्रोग्राम खत्म हो गया?
आपसे मतलब?
Have a drink with us, babe.
No, thank you.
ड्राइव पर चलोगी?
मेरी शामत आई है क्या?
We also had the hide of Blossom, the cow Jenner used to discover that cowpox can inoculate against smallpox, proudly displayed in the library. So believe me when I say that vaccines run in my blood, both literally and metaphorically, and yet I think missteps on the pro-vax side have opened the door for people like RFK Jr. I hope it is clear that RFK Jr. is not a rational voice of concern or someone whose main motivation is good and he just has some offbeat views. He is a crank, plain and simple. And that's how he was treated for many years. So the main question I'm seeking to answer is how did he end up moving not only to the mainstream, but to the highest levels of power? Now, please do not mischaracterize the points that I'm about to make. I am not apportioning equal blame for where we find ourselves. I do not think missteps by scientists are comparable to nefarious disinformation campaigns. But what I am trying to do is understand how such evidently extreme statements lost their shock value for normal people. In a way, I've been inspired by the many think pieces in the wake of the Democrats being so emphatically defeated in the US elections. People have been asking how they got it so wrong, and they've been forced to reflect. If what you're doing isn't working, it's important to try to understand why. I've not really seen the medical equivalent of this soul-searching.
The election that we just had was a repudiation of the status quo. An overly regulated system that is no longer responsive or delivering for the needs of the people.
Of course, Trump is an utterly unprecedented president, and unexpected things happen under his eye. After all, he too has promoted conspiracy theories like Barack Obama being born abroad or that the 2020 election was stolen, and he's gone on to become president twice. But even before Kennedy moved away from his family Democrat roots to become Trump's chum, he was polling higher than any independent candidate for a generation. He was doing the rounds on all the big contrarian podcasts, or as they could more accurately be called, mainstream media, and to me it seems clear that this was a foot in the door phenomenon, meaning that something RFK Jr. voiced seemed to chime with normal people, something perhaps they weren't hearing elsewhere, so they granted him the time of day and perhaps ignored his crazy talk. Then, as the Overton window has moved over the last 12 months, his crazy talk became normalized, and suddenly, Bobby's your uncle, he's health secretary. What was it that RFK said that led people to support him in spite of everything he's said before? He clearly tapped into a sense that many people had that something about health in the US is wrong, something needs fixing. While I think he presents oversimplistic and entirely wrong solutions, clearly the problems are real, and highlighting them resonated with the American public. I think there are three key areas that are especially acute in the USA, which form much of the premise of my America is making the rest of the world sick thesis, as European nations, for example, have a different approach to these issues. Number one, he has repeatedly highlighted the dire state of the standard American diet and made unfavorable comparisons of the food industry in contrast to other countries. Now, I'm not a food scientist or a policy expert. I don't pretend to know the ins and outs here, but it's clear the US has many adverse markers, such as 22% of children being obese and 42% of adults, and these numbers are rising. Number two, he's talked about the scandalous role of money in US healthcare, with financial conflicts of interest afflicting almost every department and level, perhaps most importantly, with how much influence the pharmaceutical and food industries have on the FDA. The corporate structure of America, which maximizes shareholder value above everything else, has resulted in a status quo where the public interests are not being prioritized. And again, I think people can see this with their own eyes. The fact that most don't realize that this is a scathing condemnation of unregulated capitalism is, of course, a story for another day. Number three, but I think what thrust RFK Jr. to where we find him today is, without doubt, the pandemic, and specifically the extreme polarization we saw in the US. When doing the podcast rounds, he complained about heavy-handed COVID rules, which clearly struck a chord. It was this issue that caused people to think, well, I agree with him on this, let's hear what else he has to say. You don't need, and you definitely don't want, a post hoc analysis of the entire pandemic, but it is instructive to highlight areas where the US has differed from Europe. I'm in the UK, and while I would also have criticism of my government's response, I think the scientists and doctors advising the government did a good job. Whereas in the US, they often adopted unsupported positions or failed to course correct when the data didn't support a given approach. Again, for clarity, because I know people can get the wrong end of the stick, I am not suggesting that any scientific response could have prevented the unholy alliance of anti-government and anti-science and pro-conspiracy groups. It was almost a perfect recipe to unite and embolden these disparate groups. But as someone on the side of science, it is natural I want to understand our side of the equation. Vaccine mandates has to be at the top of the list. The COVID vaccine is effective and safe, but the risk-benefit ratio is not a flat line for all recipients. It is overwhelmingly beneficial in the elderly or clinically frail, but in young healthy people, far less so. The risks of COVID are also vanishingly small for young healthy people. Both sides spent so much effort insisting that either COVID itself or the vaccines were extremely hazardous in young people, and none of the evidence backs up either of those positions. And yet many of the flashpoints in the US were around mandates for young, healthy people, such as on college campuses, insisting that healthy 20-year-old college students who had had COVID, or professional sports people or factory workers are mandated to have second, third or fourth boosters was never based on any science. We saw the rise of British anti-vaccine campaigners like Asim Malhotra and Russell Brand, who would rant and rave about vaccine mandates on, again, the Joe Rogan podcast. But we never had vaccine mandates in the UK. But the perception was that there was this global authoritarian lockdown and forced vaccinations because of how much the US experience dominated the online discussion. The US experience was not a global phenomenon. I've not been keeping track, but I know that there have been many recent and ongoing lawsuits in the US courts regarding the legality of vaccine mandates, with people who lost their jobs winning compensation. And ironically, in many countries without mandates, uptake was higher than in the US. Now, I don't assign malice to this. When vaccines first came out, we believed that they would help control the spread. So even if you were at low risk, receiving the vaccine was still a way to reduce the spread. And indeed, uptake was very high because we all wanted to do this. But by summer 2021, it was becoming clear that transmission rates were not being significantly affected. The third-party benefit, which is the only justification for mandating a medical treatment, was not robustly demonstrated. And yet, vaccine mandates stayed in place in the US until 2022, or in some cases 23. Many people lost their jobs, their livelihoods, or their places at college. And in a pandemic, you have to make decisions that might turn out to be wrong. I'm not critical of that. But the US was slow to respond to evidence, and I have not seen any admission that these strategies were wrong. Don't take my word for it. Longtime opponent of RFK Jr., Dr. Paul Offit, is an expert whose opinion I've always held in very high regard. He's a professor of pediatrics. He's a professor of vaccines and immunology. He is the co-inventor of the rotavirus vaccine and director of the Vaccine Education Center in Philadelphia. He is one of the leading proponents of childhood vaccines and a vociferous opponent to pseudoscience and quackery. And Paul Offit has said that at the age of 73, he hasn't had a COVID vaccine since 3 doses of the original Wuhan strain. But now he's approaching 75. He said he's going to get one this year, along with a flu vaccine. He said that 2 or 3 doses is enough for many people, which in 2023 put him in opposition to the CDC's recommendation that everyone over the age of 6 months should receive 2 booster shots every year. I'm not sure Americans realize how much of an outlier this makes them. I said the exact same line actually in a video about screening programs and over-investigation in America. It's almost as though there is a systemic problem in American healthcare which results in over-medicalization and the greater use of pharmaceutical products, especially newer, expensive ones. I mean, you already know you're international outliers because you're the only country that has direct-to-consumer pharmaceutical advertising. AHA, New Zealand, you might say, technically yes, but they are far more regulated than the dystopian adverts we're all familiar with from American TV. So again, America is doing its own thing and then wondering why someone like RFK Jr. comes in. Now, Paul Offit is not an anti-vaxxer by any stretch of the imagination. If policy had been guided by people like him, perhaps we would have seen less pushback. Who knows? In short, the US burned up public goodwill for the COVID vaccine, it seems, at the expense of childhood vaccines. I'm sympathetic to those who feel that what Paul Offit says, or even what I say, is too nuanced, too open to bad faith misinterpretations. The CDC and Anthony Fauci said as much, that the message needed to be simple to have the biggest impact, but I don't think anybody can argue that anymore. Again, in Europe, we did have a more nuanced, risk-adjusted approach, and people could figure out for themselves what they wanted to do. I mean, I've still got friends now who are in their 30s or even 20s who are perfectly healthy, and they are getting their COVID boosters at the first opportunity twice a year. The point is, the choice exists, and by trying to oversimplify the message, and I consider many popular science communicators and medfluencers on TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, and so on very much part of this equation, the idea that COVID vaccines should be thought of in the same way as childhood vaccines became prevalent, which I think is the biggest own goal of all. The medfluencers took to social media en masse to parrot CDC talking points rather than actually trying to analyze the evidence and look to other countries or the WHO. Indeed, anyone not advocating for the most hardline guidelines was accused of being pro-disease or anti-vax. Twitter descended into tribalism as doctors fought with each other. Polarization within medical communities grew. Then we saw expensive pharmaceutical agents like Paxlovid, for example, fast-tracked to market based on a trial, but then extrapolated to expand the indications in populations they'd never been tested in. In that case, vaccinated people or those with previous COVID infection. Paxlovid is an interesting case study. It was given emergency use authorization. It was given a special status. Pharmacists could prescribe it instead of just doctors to get it out to as many people as possible. It could even be delivered by DoorDash. But its effects are modest. It's unlikely to have caused harm, but this represents a huge expense for the American taxpayer and was and is a very profitable drug for Pfizer. We're talking something to the tune of several $billion. Next is the advice in the US regarding children. The CDC has added COVID vaccines to the routine childhood vaccine schedule, which hasn't been done in European countries. In the UK, for example, the NHS offers it to over 12s, but only recommends it if at higher clinical risk or if they are a contact of someone who is immunocompromised. The American College of Pediatricians recommended masking toddlers with completely unscientific advice like toddlers in daycare needing to wear masks, except when they are all sleeping together in a room. You didn't need to have any scientific training to understand that this made no sense. No European country recommended masking for under 6. The WHO and UNICEF themselves recommended masks for over 12s. So again, the US went its own way. School closures were significantly longer in the US than in similar countries. In the UK, my kids actually continued going to nursery school and primary school throughout the pandemic, but we did have a period where school kids learnt remotely, but it was short. In the US, school closures were prolonged. An affluent middle-class family who could migrate their work to Zoom and stay home with their children struggled through, but millions of working-class American parents found this extremely challenging, and many ended up in an abject financial state. The pandemic did not affect everybody equally, and those hardest hit are doubtless more likely to resent the measures that were taken. You can take a look at the country UNESCO dashboard, I'll put the link below, to see how much longer full and partial school closures persisted in the US compared to other countries. It really is quite striking. Professor Shamaz Ladani, clinical lead for surveillance for vaccine-preventable diseases, including COVID, at the UK Health Security Agency, and he is based at St. George's as well, an institution you've already heard is as pro-vaccination as you can imagine, wrote in December 2022, in conclusion, despite having the lowest risk of severe disease from SARS-CoV-2 infection, children have endured the most disproportionate disruption to their lives during their most formative years. We urgently need to return to first principles and focus on evidence-based interventions that help protect children not only against COVID-19, but also against other infections. An obvious first step would be to improve educational settings to provide a safer environment for staff and children. Instead of advocating for moving as much life outside as possible, the advice was to stay indoors. Physical activity was reduced, which likely had a disastrous effect on health. Beaches, parks, playgrounds, pools, gyms, and so on were closed. I mean, do you remember they were filling playgrounds with sand? The pandemic was the shot in the arm that RFK Jr. needed to propel him to center stage. In 2019, his Children's Health Defense nonprofit received $3 million in donations. In 2021, it got $16 million. Next comes a regular theme for my videos, money. RFK Jr. talks about a revolving door between industry and government, the enormous fees paid by pharmaceutical companies to the FDA, and experts who sit on advisory panels or carry out government-funded research while receiving industry money. A large proportion of FDA reviewers responsible for authorizing new therapies receive money from industry. How is that defensible? There is perhaps no greater example of the revolving door than the boss of the FDA, Scott Gottlieb, abruptly leaving to join the board of Pfizer. Prior to joining the FDA, he was a venture partner on the board of several other pharmaceutical companies. He is a doctor who public records show has received hundreds of thousands of dollars from pharma companies throughout his career, and yet he was selected as commissioner of the FDA. And he's far from alone. Multiple FDA commissioners and high-ranking officials have either come from or returned to the pharmaceutical industry. It's possible that it's a majority, although it's hard to be sure because a BMJ investigation found that the FDA keeps no records on where employees go after they leave government service, nor does it require employees to undergo an approval or clearance process before taking up an industry job. Going a little further back gives perhaps the most egregious example of the revolving door with the FDA and industry in the case of Purdue Pharma. This is a story, of course, that's been made famous now due to books like The Empire of Pain and the TV show Dopesick. But in the 90s, Curtis Wright led the agency's approval of the drug OxyContin, which came with specific language saying that it was less likely to be misused than other opiates. And this was very much the reason that Purdue was able to market the drug for a very wide population. Soon after approving the drug, just a year after leaving the FDA, Wright took up a lucrative position at Purdue Pharma. I'll be talking about financial conflicts of interest in medicine again soon, but nowhere does it like the US. When I go to medical conferences, I'm always just blown away by the declaration slides from American speakers. That's the one at the beginning of your presentation where you talk about, you just mentioned who's giving you money. Some of them have to use size 5 font on their slides, which are up for just a split second anyway, to fit all the companies that have paid them or their department money. I hate that it is so normalized. In fact, I think it's almost seen as a badge of honor. Oh, wow, he must be a real big deal to receive funding from all these companies. I was hired to do some stand-up comedy at the European Society of Cardiology's annual Congress this year, which is the largest medical conference in the world. And by the way, this is the first time they've ever had comedy. It's quite possibly, it was also the last. But I gently made fun of this practice by putting my declaration slides up and saying silly things like, I don't remember the names of cardiology trials, or I don't understand the clotting cascade, or I don't use a knife to put butter on my toast. I just rub the whole block of butter on the toast like a Pritt stick until the toast becomes practically see-through, which to a room full of cardiologists is like saying I smoke crack. But I did the whole thing as a gentle dig because I'm very proud to say that I receive zero money from the pharmaceutical industry. And in the UK, that doesn't make me unusual at all. It's very common. A lot of my colleagues can say the same thing. And I know that there are many American physicians who can say the same. You may have heard of the Sunshine Act, which dictates that doctors must declare these kinds of payments. And I'm friends with many wonderful, conscientious, unconflicted doctors in the US. But sadly, financial conflicts are very common. And with doctors coming out of medical school, hundreds of thousands in debt, maybe you can start to understand how this cycle perpetuates. But that's a topic for a whole separate video, and I just whacked the microphone. So it is entirely right to call out the flow of money from pharma into government departments. A core hypocrisy at the center of the MAHA movement is that the libertarian Trumpian diktat is unshackling industry from regulation, and yet Kennedy is arguing for much greater regulation. Republicans are simultaneously saying they don't want their government telling them what medications they can take, but then they do want their government controlling what they can eat. RFK says the FDA authorizes the use of pharmaceutical products too quickly and without good enough evidence, under pressure from Big Pharma, something I would certainly agree with in many cases. But then he also says that he wants to make it easier to bring unproven quack treatments to market, like supplements and stem cells, or widening the licenses for medications without any evidence, like authorizing ivermectin for cancer. This would be reminiscent of India, where the government authorizes the use of homeopathy as legitimate healthcare simply to give the impression that patients are being cared for. RFK constantly talks about things that he wants to ban, but in a tweet from just after Trump's win, he decries the FDA's suppression on a number of things, including sunshine and exercise. Every single guideline from hypertension, obesity, cardiovascular disease, and so on starts with the importance of exercise. And I wasn't aware that the FDA had installed a sunshade above the United States. If they do have that kind of power, then I agree they must be stopped. But let's look at the other things that he mentions in this mini manifesto. This tweet was just before his nomination for HHS. FDA's war on public health is about to end. This includes its aggressive suppression of psychedelics, peptides, stem cells, raw milk, hyperbaric therapies, chelating compounds, ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, vitamins, clean foods, sunshine, exercise, nutraceuticals, anything else that advances human health and can't be patented by pharma. If you work for the FDA and are part of this corrupt system, I have two messages for you. Preserve your records and pack your bags. Very threatening talk aimed at the thousands of ordinary, hardworking people at the FDA. So let's take a look at a few of these. Psychedelics. I actually just posted a video the other day on the second channel about how I got invited to a psychedelic retreat and briefly stated my position there. I think there is some promise. There's ongoing research happening, but I think they have become a contrarian and VC tech bro, even wellness rallying point. And while I remain interested to hear more and I'm still engaged in following the field, the hype machine has wildly overtaken the reality. I think they will likely have some benefit in some refractory psychiatric disorders, but there's probably little else. Peptides. I think I'm a bit out of the loop here from the grifterverse because I've seen medfluencers talking about peptides, but not in reference to GLP-1 analogs like Ozempic or Mounjaro or semaglutide. GLP, that's what I think of when people say peptide. GLP stands for glucagon-like peptide. But they are talking about generic and unproven peptide therapy that has become a wellness buzzword being offered for skin treatments, anti-aging, sports injuries, and all kinds of random stuff. Because RFK Jr., MAHA, and wellness medfluencers are, of course, strongly opposed to drugs like Ozempic. I confess, I've not looked into the world of peptides in depth, but I do find it amusing that these types are all in favor of peptides until a clinical trial actually shows benefit and a pharmaceutical industry sells one, because then it's bad. It's only good if it has no evidence and it's not sold by a pharmaceutical company, but by a company that sells pharmaceuticals. Big difference. Stem cells, hyperbaric therapies, chelating compounds, ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, vitamins all fall into the same category in my opinion. They are all interventions that are licensed. They are used, but for indications where they have been proven to work. With the exception of chelating compounds, they all have established efficacy for very specific things. The indications RFK Jr. claims for them, like cancer, are not proven. This is a hallmark of MAHA thinking, that certain agents have hidden uses that are being suppressed. They never stop for a second to ask, why would a company that makes any of the above, why would they voluntarily leave money on the table? Okay, next is raw milk. Raw milk. This is like one of those phenomena that makes me question whether that chart of human intelligence over the last few million years has genuinely started to nudge downwards after inexorable rise. It's like the flat earth of medicine. It's another example of one of those examples of where believers have just stopped a thought process halfway through. They say, modern milk is processed, so let's make it more natural. Even though pasteurization is literally just heating. It has no effect on the nutritional value, but they don't continue the thought experiment to ask, hang on, is it natural that an adult human is drinking cow's milk? I'm not saying I have the answer, but it just seems strange to stop halfway. But I guess they want to be cowboys and cowgirls and live off the land with their mouth to the udder. Mouth, that is a tongue twister. I think there is a way around this, though. We just need to lean in to the wellness thinking and invoke two of their other obsessions. Say, yes, raw milk is a superfood, but to truly unlock its healing power, you need to activate it using a milk sauna, also known as a saucepan, and then plunge it into a Wim Hof ice bath. We can even call it cocking, after Pasteur's great rival. It's also an amazing demonstration of groupthink. Nobody was talking about raw milk a couple of years ago or so, and then suddenly it's come out of nowhere and it's what every wellness grifter swears by. Pasteurization is kind of like childhood vaccination. It's one of those truly monumental, great public health wins, but it is one that is so ingrained into modern society that we take it for granted. I don't think the risks of raw milk are extremely high, but tell that to the mother of a child who falls sick with salmonella, E. coli, listeria, or campylobacter. I thought these people were all about caring for children's safety. Food is the one thing that he's mentioned here that needs work, even though clean food is a fairly meaningless term. Nutraceutical is a wellness marketing term that means foods with a medicinal action, like vegetables, for example, those things that are suppressed so much by the government that they recommend that you eat them on a daily basis. But as it's such a meaningless term, what I think he means here is supplements, which should simply be called what they are, unlicensed medications. More on those in that big video I'm working on, but they are the biggest grift going today, especially with the wellness and bro science podcast crowd. The fear is with RFK Jr. that his demonization of the FDA's processes and his promise to fire most of its staff will lead him to permit the manufacture and distribution of medicinal products that have not gone through the FDA approval process or clearance, such as the peptides and stem cells and supplements and so on. But also, it may permit marketing claims from these companies which have not been FDA cleared, which do not comply with FDA regulations, while device and product manufacturers who are FDA cleared, who've achieved a higher safety bar, who have gone through the process, do have to comply with FDA regulations on what they can and cannot say. This is setting up a structure that will actually benefit products which have had no testing. There is no interpretation that does not result in this being less safe for American citizens. In short, it would be the green light for anyone to start using unproven in terms of effect, but also untested for safety products on people. Imagine an unregulated stem cell industry. The results are too terrifying to think about. Already, there have been case reports of clinics using stem cells that have resulted in horrendous complications like bones growing out of eyelids. I know RFK Jr. has talked about removing fluoride from drinking water, and honestly, I don't feel I know enough about this to comment right now. I'll put some trustworthy links below. I just kind of wanted to record this today. It is 20 past midnight, and I've got clinic in the morning, so I haven't had time to look it up yet. But I don't believe any legitimate scientists in the field consider fluoride unsafe. RFK's reasons don't seem to have any basis that I can tell, and it clearly made a large positive impact when it was introduced. But we do things differently in Europe. What are other ways that you in the US are outliers when it comes to health? I don't know that these are necessarily relevant to RFK Jr.'s pick, but simply to paint a bit more of a picture as someone from outside the USA. It seems to be the only developed country that is making access to abortion more difficult. Your expenditure on healthcare as a percentage of GDP is far higher than similar countries. It's effectively the worst of both worlds, with the vast majority of that expenditure going on chronic disease with minimal government regulation of costs to patients, except when it comes to Medicare, where inflated prices sabotage the whole system, and there are eye-watering profits for insurance companies. Any American listening knows what a hellscape their medical system can be to navigate, so I won't dwell on it. Then something that's often mentioned is the USA is perhaps the only high-income country where the life expectancy has actually reduced. But interestingly, when you tease this apart, there are three main drivers: the pandemic, gun crime, and the opiate crisis. Now, clearly the Republican Party have no plans to tackle the second of these, but the opiate crisis is worth highlighting again because it hasn't featured heavily in MAHA's statements and recent discussions about health. But of course, much of the blame can again be laid at the doorstep of the pharmaceutical industry's corrupting influence and American healthcare. America really is making itself and everyone else sick. I fully understand the desire to appoint a disruptor, an outsider, someone who's going to shake things up. But RFK Jr. is not the only person voicing legitimate concerns. You have many medical professionals, scientists, or established politicians, or other lawyers who say similar things. And while they may still have objectionable views in some fields, they have relevant expertise and experience and do not say patently absurd, disproven, unscientific things. There are many appointments that make more sense than RFK Jr., so one has to assume that he has been chosen specifically due to his celebrity as a Kennedy and the fact that Trump and he appear to be good friends. But if you expect him to tear the place down and rebuild it, as some senior officials and doctors have said, you are deluding yourself. There are scientists and doctors who talk about all the problems I've mentioned in this video. I know many of them feel like they're shouting into a void. By failing to listen to them and actually bringing about change, the incumbent powers have let wellness grifters and MAHA find an audience.
A repudiation of the status quo, an overly regulated system that is no longer responsive or delivering for the needs of the people.
It's also unrealistic to see all these problems purely as an effect of pharma or agriculture or food and so on. This involves every strata, every aspect of American culture. Cities that are designed for cars. Almost nobody walks or cycles or uses public transport. Junk food is cheap and ubiquitous. Marketing is unrestricted. School meals are poor quality with federal programs that pay for unprocessed food, and so on. The remit for Secretary of the HHS includes the NIH, the National Institutes for Health, which I mentioned at the beginning, a superpower in international medical research, and coincidentally where many vaccines were pioneered and where fluoride's role in preventing tooth decay was discovered. Like the FDA, the CDC, and so on, it has problems. But the NIH is one of the things that makes America great. If Kennedy comes good on his promise to gut these institutions, it will do anything but make America healthy nor great. In short, the four horsemen of the healthcare apocalypse: financial conflicts of interest, a dysfunctional healthcare system, the pandemic, and an ever-present anti-science, anti-intellectual mentality that Asimov famously said runs through America, have opened the door to let the winds of change blow in. But instead of somebody responsible who can act urgently on these very real problems, a demonstrably unscientific, ignorant charlatan has stepped through the door. Congratulations, America. You played yourself. If you've made it this far, then thank you very much. People like you actually make me hopeful that we can have differing opinions and still respect one another. There are wrong and extreme things that people say, and we should always call those out. But I also believe that rational, sensible people can, there's room for disagreement and mutual respect. The fact you've listened this far when I presume you don't agree with me on everything, and that's fine, is a testament to that. Now, this is not a sponsored video, but it's probably the only video I'm going to post this entire calendar year on the main channel. So I wanted to take the opportunity to tell you about Nebula. And see, that's how you can tell that I really mean what I'm saying, because even when there's no promotional money on the line, I still want to spread the good word of Nebula like a proper missionary. And the reason is that I love being part of this project. I really enjoy and I'm proud of what we have created at Nebula. If you've heard me talk about Nebula before, please just stick around for 1 minute. I've got a couple of other things to mention, but if you haven't, it's a streaming platform that I post all my videos to before I post them to YouTube. But more importantly, you find hundreds of other creators there as well. What people may not realize is that we actually have tons of exclusive and original content that can be found only on Nebula. I'm going to post one of my comedy talks from earlier in the year that I've been meaning to for months, and I'm only going to post that on Nebula. But yeah, I must get around to it. If I don't in the next couple of weeks, then you have my permission to accost me in the street and tell me that the bowel is a better organ than the heart, and I will just accept it with cowed acquiescence and shame. One of the things we're most proud of are Nebula Originals, which are professional level productions made by your favorite indie creators. The one I've been enjoying this month is Tom Nicholas's Boomers. And Tom's a friend of mine, but I wasn't entirely sure I wanted to watch a video about boomers and millennials fighting. I thought I've had enough of intergenerational warfare for one lifetime, but actually I'm so glad I watched it. It's not like that at all. It's a really fun, educational documentary film. So listen, I'll level with you, because right now I think I post fewer videos than pretty much anyone. So I don't have the opportunities to promote Nebula. That's how we bring in new subscribers, by advertising in our videos. And violins ready, please. I don't feel like I'm contributing to the project right now. So if you want a cracking little subscription at a great price to watch fantastic videos, and you want to help the channel, or that could be an or you want to help the channel, then sign up now using my code below. Because if you use that code, it's normally $6 a month. as the monthly rate. But if you use my code, then you can sign up for the annual price of $36, which, if you don't know your 12 times table, is only $3 a month. I mean, that's pretty good value, right? Or if you have been inspired by my missionary zeal and you want to become a proper nebulite and join the culture, then you can get a lifetime membership for $300, which is lifetime. It is access forever. One-off payment, no recurring payments. And we've also introduced guest passes where you can gift a week's worth of Nebula to a friend or relative for free for them as part of your subscription. So to get a yearly Nebula subscription for only $36 for the whole year, which is $3 a month, head over to go.nebula.tv/Medlife Crisis and sign up today. Or you can take the monthly option and just go at $6 a month. All right, last thing, if you're in the UK, I'm going to do yet another Evening of Unnecessary Detail in December. I haven't even genuinely decided what I'm going to be talking about at all, leave aside having written it, and it's only a few days away. So maybe, come and watch me bomb on stage, perhaps.